Greetings everyone, it has been a while. As you can see, I am still at work. This is one of the skid trailers that we live in while we work. I have been unable to upload any videos or even record any videos. I'm recording this on May 30th. I'm not sure when I'll be able to upload it. Because of the incident that happened with me earlier, I not only got a raise, but I was also given an assistant, which was nice, but it also means that I really don't have any privacy either when I'm at work or when I'm off work. Also, the way they have it set up here, I used to have almost complete autonomy. I was the only person in an office. Any other employees in our company were hundreds or thousands of miles away, and I basically could do whatever I want. And even though I make more money and I'm still nominally in charge, I just have a lot more company, both when I'm working and when I'm not working, and that has put a huge stopper on the amount of material that I can record and what I can upload. The internet access out here is not really sufficient for uploading videos, which is not the case earlier. In other periods, I was able to return to a company house that had a decent Wi-Fi that I had free access to that allowed me to upload videos. That's not the case here. I may be able to upload these videos via my iPhone, and if I do upload this relatively quickly, it will be on my iPhone, but that will actually probably entail a fee for me, since every gigabyte I upload is another $10 or $15, I think, on my plan. I'm not hurting for money, but I'm frugal enough to be hesitant to do that. But if you see this video within the next few days of the end of May, that means that I was so interested in uploading a video that I went ahead and paid for that. So there's been, even though I haven't been able to upload videos, I have been able to do a lot of reading. Not as much as I would like, but not an insignificant amount. And I have had a lot of things that I would like to talk about, and it's just kind of been a question of realizing there's going to be a backlog at the end of this. Well, when I return to New Hampshire, I'll have ample time and so many topics to cover, and then you end up getting 7 or 8 videos in a row, and I just try to avoid that if possible. So this is going to be kind of a confluence of several topics that I've been interested in over the years that I've almost made videos on, or videos on in part, and it's going to stem from my continuing study of the history of China. So just today I finished another book called The Troubled Empire, China in the Yuan and Ming Dynasties. So for those of you who don't know, the Yuan dynasty was the dynasty that ruled China when Marco Polo visited there under Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Chinggis or Genghis Khan. Temujin, the great Mongolian conqueror, his grandson Kublai established a long-lasting, about 100-year dynasty in China. The rest of his empire dissolved into other political units. That was one of the shorter-lived dynasties in Chinese history, and it was replaced in 1398 by the Ming dynasty, after a long series of incredibly major and destructive peasant uprisings. And the Ming dynasty lasted a long time, up until 1644, and even somewhat after. The Ming dynasty is in many ways kind of the typical archetypal of Chinese culture. People think of Ming vases, of the painting, of the poetry, of the books, of the opulence, of the idea that China is this big, rich, powerful country. Many of these ideas stem from the Ming. For no other reason, this is when Europeans really started to have extensive contact with China. Obviously, Marco Polo had been there before. I think Europeans had heard something of it before that, although it would have been very sketchy. The Ming is just starting in the first and second decades of the 16th century, 1510, 1520, first starting in the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, Dutch, and English. And the Ming is sort of the empire that we often think of as Chinese. The Qing, the subsequent dynasty, is another invader dynasty, and I think that it doesn't quite occupy the imagination that the Ming does. Anyway, I didn't want to just talk about the history of China. A subject that comes up in this book, and it comes up in all the histories of China that I've read so far, although if I go far enough back this won't continually be the case, is the examination system. And this is also an intersecting interest in the fact that it's the end of the year, it's graduation time. And we always get a new cadre of graduates, both at the high school level and at the collegiate level. And I don't get a ton of fan mail or anything like that, but when I do get messages, one of the most common questions that I get asked is, should I go to college? Where should I go to college? Should I get a job? And also a lot of people ask if I can get them a job. And I think it's interesting because there is a confluence here, and there are certain aspects of the examination system as it existed in Imperial China and our current educational system that are interesting. Now, in terms of like libertarianism and political theory, I was first kind of alerted to the examination system by several comments that I think were responses to me on one of my very early videos about bureaucracy, where somebody made a comment to the effect that bureaucracies can work as long as they're not based on nepotism or cronyism. If they're based on merit, if they're based on some kind of objective rubric of ability, then you can staff the agencies of the government with qualified people, and that these people then can run society for the benefit of all. And the archetypal example of this is the examination system as used in Imperial China. Now, I don't know the entire history of this system. From what I understand, and those who may know better, feel free to correct me, but starting in the Tang, and then much more in the Song dynasties, and the Tang dynasty started in the 8th century, and the Song dynasty, I believe, started in the 10th century. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Both these were large, successful territorial dynasties in Chinese history. There was a shift away from an aristocracy. You used to have some, not classical feudalism in the European sense, at least at that period. Maybe in earlier parts of China you did, but you have noble families that had a class system based on genealogy, and the rulers of these dynasties became suspicious of their power, as they always should. These would always be competing political elites, people who could potentially usurp the throne, have their own power base, their own interest groups, and a way to, traditionally people from highborn families would staff the government, staff the military, control the bureaucracy, just making it that much easier for them to initiate a coup if they so decided. And so the idea came, maybe we should not staff the bureaucracy and the military and other government institutions with people who are noble, but with people who are common and who simply have demonstrated an ability, a merit, to run these facilities. And this would have two major potential benefits. One, you'd have presumably people who are better qualified, so that their qualification is they did well on a test, as opposed to they have the right last name or the right father. And also, you could spare yourself some danger of revolution or being overthrown, because you're picking people at random, or not at random, but from a cross-section of society, and they have to earn it, and so there's no heredity in this, and so this system developed. Now, it wasn't uniformly applied. When the Mongols took over, they did not really utilize the examination system nearly as much, but it was thoroughly reinstated, not right away, but soon into the Ming, and was a major aspect of the Ming, and then later of the Qing dynasty. And one thing about these tests that's repeated over and over again, that's almost mythic in its reputation, is that they were apparently extremely difficult. These tests had a very high attrition rate. There were basically 3 levels. There was the provincial level, and like there's like the local level, like a provincial level, and then there was like a national level. You go to the capital, and there was a high attrition rate at every level. And you read many examples of people who would study their entire lives and never pass the first level. or maybe they would pass the first level, and then 25 years later they will still not have passed the second level. Now, what these levels entitled you, if you passed the first level, you got a certain title, and that allowed you to work at a certain layer of the bureaucracy at the lowest level, which was good. You would guarantee a certain degree of income, a certain amount of prestige, a certain amount of a certain rank in the hierarchy of society that you wouldn't otherwise have. Obviously, the next level is more so, and the final level, potentially you'd be in a position to be a national figure. So many people aspired to this. It was considered an easy way to make money, an easy way to have power and prestige, an easy way to have conspicuous wealth and I just wanted to repeat myself, prestige or status in society, status, that's the word. And so there was a lot of competition, and many people didn't pass. And so there's a famous line from the book Into the West, that's how it's usually rendered in English, which is also the basis of Dragon Ball Z, a description of people who take these tests as basically being completely lifeless, no blood, no heart, no eyes, no ears, just completely dedicated to studying to pass these tests. And by virtue of their difficulty, the implication is that these people who do pass are highly qualified to fulfill bureaucracy and run the state, and by extension, society. The first problem with this is as you become familiar with these tests, more familiar. Again, I would not say I am super familiar, but the more and more familiar you become with them, it becomes very questionable whether the skills that are being tested and measured are the skills that would be the best for administering society in any kind of Benthamite sense. There's a heavy dosage of the Chinese classics of Confucius and Mencius especially, and the Analects, and there is a very stylized form of essay that was it's called an eight-legged essay, and it was very much about filial piety and Confucian belief and the nature of the universe, yin and yang, maybe some Taoism. I don't know everything that would be in there, and it probably changed over time. In fact, at the very end, it did change. At the very end. And so, the people who are being selected for high office are people who can speak in a very refined style, the so-called Mandarin, the dialect that was spoken in Nanking, which was the capital of the Song Dynasty. It was the southern Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty had to move its capital because of Mongolian incursions. And that dialect sort of became the de facto dialect of the people in this class, of the literati, as they're sometimes called. And of course, over time, it actually developed its own kind of speech, which was incomprehensible to most other Chinese people, which is not that unique because there's so many dialects in China that there are many that were mutually incomprehensible. And you look at what they're testing for, and you have to wonder, is this really doing well on these tests? Does that really indicate that somebody is in a position that they should control the lives of millions of people, which was what was happening at the very least at the national level, even at the provincial level for that matter, sometimes even at the county level. Now, there's a couple of things here, because the idea of having a state based on meritocracy is quite common, and I think that this is a good illustration that it's not as simple as many people hope it to be, because when you have a merit-based system, the question is what is merititious and what is not, because how you answer that question is going to determine who does well on the tests and who ends up controlling everything. If we were to have, it's very difficult. I don't think that we can definitively prove an objective ethic. It certainly would be nice, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't such a thing. But if we were to try and attempt to have some kind of Benthamite notion of the most good for the most people, or if we did develop an objective ethic, to use that, it's very unlikely that, well, it's certainly the case with the examination system that it did not meet that standard. And any test that the government comes up, it is very unlikely that it's going to meet that standard. Uh, and so there's that problem. There's also the problem of it's not really fair in the sense that people like to think. Let's take, for example, these examination systems in China. In order to do well on these tests, you couldn't just be a well-intentioned, bright person. You had to master an extremely esoteric style and a group of knowledge. And in order to do that, you basically had to study intensively. And in order to afford to do that, you needed to devote basically the majority of your time, and you could not live a normal life. Uh, if you were a peasant farmer and you were had to work in the fields every day, you would never be able to, unless perhaps you were the most extraordinary individual, to pass the examinations. And in reality, almost none ever did. What ended up happening is only those who could be wealthy enough that they could subsidize their sons to basically spend their time studying and having tutors and going to special schools would have any hope, and even people like that would have a difficult time often in advancing in the system. And people who were capable of passing the tests in that way did not come from a magical cross-section of the entire country of China. The peripheral areas like Yunnan by Burma, or in the north, or on the southern coast, produced few or none who made it to the national level. Obviously, they made some people in the lower levels, but the people who were in charge at a national and provincial level were very, very few. Increasingly, starting in the Song dynasty and becoming much more obvious in the Ming and the Qing, was the economic development in the lower Yangtze River around what is today Shanghai. This became economically the richest area in the country, and significantly greater number of people were graduating from this area than from any other, especially compared to North China. I think he gives an example in this book of a single year in the 16th century where of the 80 or so people who graduated at the national level. So in China, the whole country, you have 80 people passing the exam at the national level. All of them were from a relatively small, less than a single province in the Yangtze River, and none of them came from, say, the Beijing area, the northern half of the country. Now, this posed its own problems. Obviously, the emperors became worried that all of a sudden you'd have a country that was run by everybody from a single area, and that would give that single area de facto control over the country. And so they began to institute, from time to time, a form of affirmative action. They wanted to have people from other areas in positions of power, and so they used their political influence as sovereigns of the country, of the state, to get their a bigger mix. And so there was a famous case where the emperor said, well, of these 86, I think maybe you should re-look at the test and see if maybe there were people who deserved it from the northern areas of China. And the chief examiners said, okay, I will look at it again. And he looked at them again. He came out with the exact same number before, and he was executed. And then the next time they did it, lo and behold, a large number of students from the northern parts of the country were entered. Now, this illustrates two things, I think. One is that certain classes of people are going to be predisposed to doing well at these tests, whatever the tests happen to be. There's no such thing as a test that is universally accessible to everyone in an egalitarian sense. And for leftists, this is already something they believe in, since they believe that standardized testing will discriminate against minorities, especially blacks, relative to whites. But that's only a single example of the potential here. Any kind of metric that you're going to pick is going to be easier for one group than another. And that group doesn't necessarily have to be racial. It could be any number of characteristics. The other thing it demonstrates is that the state can manipulate the test to get whatever results they want. And so the idea that you're going to have some objectively ideal system, it's only objectively ideal from the point of view of the state, not of society generally. And that goes back to the point of what is merititious. If we're going to take, I think the closest thing we can come, in my opinion, the least controversial version of a best good for best people is the kind of reasoning where you say, okay, if two people make an exchange and they both agree, then they're both better off, at least in their own estimation, at least at the time. Of course, they can change their minds later, and maybe other people watching might not think it's a fair exchange, but you have that, and then you have obviously the coercive. This is something all libertarians believe, like a unilateral exchange where one party takes something at the expense of another, and that's obviously either socially neutral or negative, depending on how you measure it. It's obviously inferior to the former example. And I think incorporating that logic, the most merititious kind of test that you can have is basically an entrepreneurial one. If you're able to provide profit, if you're able to voluntarily provide people things that they desire, and both make yourself wealthy and make others wealthy without coercing anybody else, I have a hard time not thinking that would meet that standard. But anything that goes through the government, you have to have some kind of objective ethic that is better than that, that is more correct than that. And I don't know of any that are. I've heard people say, well, they're hypothetical. It could be an objective ethic, and none of them have been that convincing to me. And even in the ones that were, they'd have to also not just, it's not enough to say there's hypothetically an objective ethic. You have to show that A, there is, that's true, and also that whatever the state's doing is meeting that ethic. If not, you get this a lot where people say, well, hypothetically, there could be this. And it's like, well, even if there was, if the state's not doing it, then it's not a justification of the state. Like if we said, well, to use Michael Huemer as an example, if sometimes a violation of the NAP is okay in certain situations, that doesn't mean, well, state power is now justified, because only for that to logically be true, the state would have to be analogous to those violations of the NAP, and the violations that most people accept, saving a drowning girl or breaking into a cabin, those do not cover even the tiniest fraction of state power. So likewise, we could say, well, maybe there is some magic test, and it really would be magic, to be honest, but let's say that hypothetically one exists. Unless the state is going to have that same test, then it's not a justification for whatever system the state happens to be using. So those are the problems with the system, but here's some of the results. I think this is where it gets a little bit more contemporaneous. These people who take these tests in ancient China, and I think as I describe them, I think people will start to know where this is going to go, because it is analogous, and to a certain extent, to things that they'll be more familiar with. You had to spend years and years of your life. Now, it could cost money. It probably did. It more likely cost resources or opportunity costs. You weren't working in the fields. You weren't making other money. You were studying for these exams. And the pressure to do well was extraordinary. People went crazy. People committed suicide. In the 19th century, a certain person who passed the first level and not the second level, after all his family's hopes were crushed, and I've related this before, he became disgruntled enough that he started his own religion. He started a rebellion, and 20 million people died. That's the Taiping Rebellion. Wouldn't lay all of that on the feet of the examination system, but just to give you some notion. What happens, though, for the people who do make it? They become extremely invested in the system and in the state, and I believe this is one of the chief benefits to the government. You end up with this large class of people who tend to be the wealthier people, who tend to be more intellectual because they've had time to study, although the stuff that they study is not necessarily going to be that applicable to the real world. And the only way they're going to get a dividend on their return is via state power. At least that's the way they think. It's not actually always true. There are plenty of stories of people who left state service either because they made it or never made it, but then went on and became merchants or entrepreneurs of one degree or another, something that existed to a decent degree in China. and became wealthy and had good lives. So the idea that you had to go wasn't factual, but that's what most people thought. And what happens is most of these people look and they think the only way I'm ever going to get all this time and effort I put in paid off is through the government. And so they are de facto for the government. And what is this analogous to is obviously people today who spend years and years in education learning stuff that is of dubious social value. If it wasn't of dubious social value, they'd have no trouble making a living. Uh, they incur enormous debts, which is slightly dissimilar. They don't have to worry about starving because they're not working in the fields, but they do have to worry about the debt slavery they've essentially put themselves in. And the only way they see themselves getting out of it is in the bureaucracy. Now, it's not literally true, but many of these people, certainly in certain I mean, this is definitely true for people who want to be educators, people who want to get doctorates and become professors. They have essentially pigeonholed themselves into a situation where they have to work for the government. Literally true all the time? No. There are non-state institution possibilities, of course, even those have state licensing and that sort of thing. But they have invested into the system, and they have a stake in the system now. And it's also this may not be true, but of course you have the people who think the only way they're ever going to pay this back is if the government pays it. And this sort of, it's interesting because there's this very analogous kind of implicit promise. If you work hard and you do good at the examination, you'll get a state position in the bureaucracy at one level or another, and you'll have a good life and you'll have a status. And we have a very similar kind of implicit assumption. Similar but not identical, because again, you'll get a certain degree of status by having a college degree, and then you will be guaranteed some level of income. Now, not necessarily from the state, and I will point out that is a major, major difference. I think we just say we're in a post-industrial revolution world, and the only ways to get out of subsistence aren't necessarily through the state, which is the way people kind of probably looked at things back then, although even then it wasn't totally true. So I would say that's a major difference in the analogy, but I think that there's a certain similarity in mentality when I see all these people out with signs like I have a $150,000 debt on my education, or I have 3 doctorates, or I have a master's degree, or I have blah 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 blah, and all they want is the government to take care of it. All these people with a high degree of regularity are extremely pro-government. And it's because I think that they bought into the system and they believe that they're entitled through their efforts, whether they actually deserve it or not, and whether they've actually earned anything or not. And I think it would be a good lesson for them to realize that they're a tool of the government if they believe that. If they believe that. Now, it's different if they act differently, because they're also wrong, because there's hope beyond there. Like plenty of people in the examination system dropped out and did well. Some of them became their own rebel leaders and ruled millions and millions of people. If you want to call that successful or not, it's debatable. But that would be highly atypical. But many of them became successful merchants, successful art collectors, poets, painters, essayists, authors, many, many things, especially in the Ming. And people today, there's this big misconception that you go to college and then you just, a good remunerative job, even one that's not necessarily from the government, is just going to fall in your lap. And then people get done with college and it never happens, and then they're embittered, and they blame society, and they look to the one institution that's supposed to help you whenever there's a problem in society. That is the state, for most people anyway. Some people it's religion, but most people it's the state. And it's really sad. But you need to realize that if you're a hardworking person and you have a good work ethic, and if you have entrepreneurial skill, which I think most people can develop if they try. I'm not saying that I've done it personally, but it's possible. There is hope for you. You can take whatever you learn, even if it's not applicable at all, and just through your vigor as a human being, through the intuitive power of the brain that you evolved, like, you can do well in spite of the fact that you may be wasted 20 years and $150,000, $200,000 when you figure, it'd be more like $300,000 if you figure like opportunity costs and all that. Depends on what level of degree you get. But it's very hard for people to do that since they've been mentally for so many years. I mean, it really goes back through public schooling all the way, at least for me, and I think most people would agree with this, public schools are very much geared towards training people for college on the assumption that you have to go to college. I mean, if you don't go to college, you're a loser, you'll fail, blah, 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 blah. And if you do go to college, it's like getting the golden ticket from Willy Wonka, or something akin to that. Their status, it's respectable, and you can get a good job. Again, a big difference, not necessarily with the government. That's maybe what I would consider the biggest difference, other than the fact that we're speaking English and they're speaking Chinese and the time difference and all that. But a large number of them, and especially those who want to be educators or take other parts, and it depends on the degree you get, they are invested in the system, and they'll be invested in the system probably for the rest of their lives. They have been they have sculpted themselves. The government has created incentives that causes people to sculpt themselves, even if they never get the direct subsidy, even if they don't get the good job, which most of them won't. Even if they don't get the subsidy or the status, they still aspire to that, and they see that as the solution. And it works very well for the state. Now, I don't know if this is all, consciously a plot or whatever. It may just simply be, when you have access to so many resources, whatever you do is going to have an effect like this in society, and that's definitely what the Chinese dynasties, the emperors, they wanted to rule. They needed people to delegate to, and they needed a way to figure out who was going to do that, and so they came up with this system. It wasn't the only possible thing they could have done. Whatever they would have done, though, people would have morphed themselves to game that system. Not necessarily in a fraudulent way, although that also happened. But at the very least, what do I need to do to pass this? What do I need to do well in the system? And those people then sculpt themselves to be cogs in the state machine, at their own expense, typically. And we have a similar phenomenon today. And so my advice to those of you, don't be a cog in the state machine. It's not all that it promises. I mean, there are pros and cons, but the cons far outweigh the pros. And that's not even coming at it from like, I'm a libertarian and I'm going to consider everything the government does as inherently evil. I mean, yes, that's true, but even ignoring that, you become, your job, your pay, your livelihood becomes a plaything for the government. Now, they have the power to do that to anybody, but it's easier for people who they already employ. And it will destroy your soul. I swear to God. Like, freedom and liberty are relative things, and the fact that you're in the private market doesn't mean that you're a frontiersman without any government, or that you live in anarcho-capitalism. But it's a step in that direction away from being just another filer or stamper or public school teacher or whatever other government job that you may aspire to. So yeah, and I am always amazed when people talk about how this is something that we should emulate. Clearly, it's something that didn't work. Towards the end of the Qing dynasty, many people started to say, why are the people who run the government have to write essays about Confucian philosophy? Shouldn't they learn things about, like, I don't know, engineering or civics or something like that? And the kind of the easy retort to all this is say, yeah, if we just change the test, your objections would be invalid. But if we didn't teach Confucianism, but if we instead taught math or economics or whatever, wouldn't it be better? Not necessarily. We don't know what the objectively correct pedagogy is for somebody to rule society. And whatever things we did select, whatever errors we made would then become systemic errors that would be almost incorrectable, because people wishing to seek to pass the test and to advance in the system would be incorporating those biases into everything that they did in preparation, which would mean they wouldn't be able to cope with those mistakes, and also they'd be very unable to even recognize them. So there's that. And of course, even if there was such a thing as a Benthonite notion of best thing for everybody, the state is never going to institute that. It is always going to institute the test that's going to teach people what's best for them. And that is another thing. These dynasties would make sure that it emphasized the legitimacy of the emperor. The Manchus, since they were invaders, really emphasized the mandate of heaven, and how, look, even if we're not Chinese, Confucian philosophy pretty much mandates that we should be in control. Here's the reason why, and that's what the test is about. And if you became in the government, you spent years and years and years and years and years trying to learn that, to the point where if you didn't believe it, which most of them probably would, you'd at least know that's how you're supposed to talk all the time. And the idea that the government would institute a program of testing that is best for society but not best for itself is completely ridiculous. Unfortunately, most people don't make that distinction, and they just kind of assume, well, whatever the government does, that is what's best for everybody else, even though this is clearly not the case on many, many issues and many, many topics. So again, that's assuming a hypothetical optimum to justify a reality that falls far short of that by any measure, which is true of so many arguments for the government. Yeah, that's another video. I'll see if I can upload this pretty quick, and I will talk to you all later. Hopefully I'll see some of you at PorcFest in a month. I'll definitely be there, so it'd be cool to see some of you all there as well. All right, bye-bye.